In modern America, it is no longer enough to have an opinion. That opinion has to be assigned political, cultural, and moral meaning. Over time, politics in America has become more than disagreement over policy. It has turned into a fight over values, identity, culture, and power. It shapes how people think, how they vote, how they see each other, and even how they interpret everyday life. In this video, I want to walk through the political spectrum, explain the values behind each part, and identify who represents what. This graphic is not meant to label every person perfectly. Instead, they are tools to help explain broad political ideas, how they differ, and how they relate to one another. This is a one-dimensional political spectrum, running from far left on one side to far right on the other. This is the most familiar version of the political spectrum. It places political beliefs along a single line. On the far left, the focus is usually on ideas like collective ownership, anti-capitalism, and major structural change. Moving a little towards the center, the left tends to emphasize economic equality, labor rights, strong public services, and redistribution. In the center left, the emphasis often shifts to social justice, regulated markets, civil rights, and climate action. At the center, the focus is usually on pragmatism, compromise, and maintaining stability through a mixed economy. Then at the center right, values often include personal responsibility, market-based solutions, tradition, and gradual reform. On the right, the focus usually becomes limited government, free enterprise, law and order, and national interest. And on the far right, there are more extreme positions associated with authoritarian nationalism, rigid hierarchy, and hardline traditionalism. This suggests politics is just left versus right, when in reality, political beliefs are often more complex than that. In this visual, the horizontal axis represents economics. On the left side, you have what is called the economic left. That usually means more redistribution, more public programs, and stronger government regulations of the economy. On the right side, you have the economic right. That usually means more free markets, lower taxes, less regulation, and stronger belief in private enterprise. The vertical axis represents social power and personal freedom. At the top, you see authoritarian or socially conservative positions. That means more emphasis on order, tradition, restrictions, and stronger state authority. At the bottom, you see libertarian or socially liberal positions. That means more emphasis on personal freedom, civil liberties, and less government control over private life. This creates four quadrants. The top left quadrant is left authoritarian. That would include positions that are economically collectivist, but also socially restrictive. The bottom left quadrant is left libertarian. That is where you often find beliefs that are economically progressive and socially liberal. The top right quadrant is right authoritarian. That includes market-oriented economics combined with social conservatism, stronger hierarchy, or stronger state enforcement of order. The bottom right quadrant is right libertarian. That combines free market economics with a strong emphasis on personal liberty and limited government interference in private life. Communism is placed at the far economic left and somewhat toward the authoritarian side, because it is associated with collective economics and historically, many highly centralized states. Democratic socialism is placed left of center, but lower on the chart, because it tends to combine progressive economics with more democratic and socially liberal values. The Peace and Freedom Party and the Green Party appear on the left libertarian side, since they are generally progressive economically and liberal socially. The Democratic Party is placed near the center left, slightly toward the libertarian side, reflecting its broad coalition and mix of moderate and progressive factions. Moderates and independents are near the center because they often combine views from different sides, depending on the issue. The Republican Party is placed at the center right and somewhat higher on the chart, reflecting a general orientation toward market economics and more socially conservative positions. National conservatism and the Constitution Party are shown further to the right in the authoritarian quadrant because they place greater emphasis on tradition, national identity, and social order. The Libertarian Party is placed in the right libertarian quadrant because it generally combines free market economics with strong support for personal freedom and limited state power. And the alt-right is placed far to the right and high on the authoritarian side because it is associated with extreme nationalism and more authoritarian social ideas. A person can be economically left but socially authoritarian, or economically right but socially libertarian. This third visual focuses less on labels and more on the values that often drive political beliefs. Starting at the far left, the core values shown are collective ownership, anti-capitalism, class struggle, and transformative change. That reflects the belief that existing economic systems are deeply unequal and need to be fundamentally replaced. Moving to the left, the values become economic equality, labor rights, strong public services, and redistribution. This reflects a belief that the government should play a strong role in reducing inequality and supporting workers and communities. In the center left, the core values are social justice, regulated markets, civil rights, and climate action. This part of the spectrum often supports capitalism, but believes it needs stronger rules, protections, and reforms to produce fair outcomes. At the center, the values are pragmatism, compromise, mixed economy, and institutional stability. This reflects a preference for balance, moderation, and working within existing systems rather than pushing ideological change. On the center right, the values listed are personal responsibility, market solutions, tradition, and gradual reform. This reflects a belief that social stability and economic freedom are important, but that change should be careful and incremental. On the right, the values are limited government, free enterprise, law and order, and national interest. This emphasizes individual initiative, a smaller government role in the economy, and stronger social order and national cohesion. On the far right, the values listed are authoritarian nationalism, social hierarchy, hardline identity politics, and extreme traditionalism. This section represents more extreme positions that are well outside the political mainstream. Across the spectrum, some people prioritize equality, some prioritize liberty, some prioritize tradition, some prioritize order, some prioritize reform, while others prioritize stability. I'm going to use real-life political commentators and influencers as examples and place them on the political spectrum where I think they best fit. The point is not to say these people define an entire ideology on their own, but that their rhetoric, style, and priorities can help illustrate where different parts of the spectrum tend to fall. The way they speak, the issues they emphasize, and the kind of audience they attract often reflect the values they represent. Starting on the far left. In practice, that often shows up in people who reject authority altogether and see institutions themselves as illegitimate. Anarchists would be people who loot, riot, and burn down buildings while protesting. The left is represented by people like Dean Withers and Parker. Their style tends to be emotionally charged, morally urgent, and heavily focused on social justice language. That reflects values like equality, activism, and calling out perceived oppression. Destiny and Jon Stewart represent the center left, with Adam Mockler somewhere in between them. Their style differs from the activist left. It is usually more argument-driven, reform-oriented, and grounded in mainstream liberal values rather than in pure ideological outrage. That reflects a center-left position, socially progressive, critical of the right, but still operating more within the existing system rather than against it. Bill Maher sits dead center. His style reflects that position because he criticizes both sides, rejects ideological purity, and leans heavily on skepticism. That is usually what the center looks like, less interested in partisan loyalty and more interested in pushing back on extremes. Piers Morgan aligns with the center right. His style is combative, but not usually ideological in the same way as the more hardline conservatives. He tends to defend order, tradition, and common sense cultural norms. Bill O'Reilly and Ben Shapiro represent the right-wing conservative space. Their style is assertive, structured, and rooted in defending traditional values, personal responsibility, and mainstream conservative politics. That style reflects the right because it prioritizes order, hierarchy, and the preservation of established institutions over progressive change. Andrew Wilson fits into what I would describe as the alt-right white Christian nationalist space. His style is sharper, more provocative, and more openly tied to identity, nationalism, and civilizational themes than mainstream conservatism. That reflects a worldview that goes beyond ordinary right-wing politics and moves toward a hard-line exclusionary form of politics. Matan Evan represents the alt-right in a more comedic way, like Jon Stewart does on the left. His style matters because humor can make extreme ideas seem less serious, more entertaining, and therefore easier for people to absorb. Even when presented as comedy, that style can still reflect and reinforce far-right cultural instincts. Nick Fuentes represents the alt-right white nationalist position more directly. His style is more explicit and openly centered on race, nationalism, and hierarchy. That places him further to the extreme end of the spectrum, because he is not just defending conservatism, but advancing a more openly nationalist and exclusionary political identity. There is clearly more representation on the far right than on the far left, particularly in online media and political commentary. The far right often shifts the spectrum by framing even moderate or center-left figures as anarchists, communists, or radicals. That kind of labeling distorts where people actually stand and makes the political landscape look more extreme than it really is. People are drawn to different parties that call to them. If you are a white man who wants to practice your religion, raise a family in a safe neighborhood, and live without constantly worrying about disorder or violence, which party are you most likely to turn to? If you are a woman who spent her teenage years and young adulthood dealing with men who groped you, talked down to you, or told you that your real purpose was simply to find a husband and have children, but you are 10 times smarter than any man you have met, and you want to pursue financial independence, professional success, and personal ambition, which party are you most likely to turn to? If you are someone who believes you belong at the top of the social hierarchy, and you are frustrated that women and minorities are closing the gap beneath you, not because you are struggling to survive, but because your advantages are shrinking, which party are you most likely to turn to? If your resentment comes from the fact that you may have to wait a few more years for luxury, status, or comfort because society is becoming more equal, which party are you likely to embrace? These questions get at something deeper than party labels. Politics is not just about policy. It's about identity, fear, aspiration, resentment, and the kind of social order people want to preserve or create. People often turn to political movements not only because of what they believe in, but because of what they feel is being threatened. For some, that threat is safety, faith, and stability. For others, it is autonomy, dignity, and the chance to define their own future. And for others still, the threat is the loss of status they once took for granted. That is part of what makes politics so emotionally charged. Different people are responding to completely different life experiences, different fears, and different expectations about what society should look like. The party they choose often reflects not just their material interests, but their worldview and the kind of cultural reality they want reinforced. How did we become so extreme? The Clinton and Bush eras felt, in hindsight, a lot more politically unifying than the period we are living through now. That does not mean those years were free of conflict or controversy. But both presidents still operated within what most Americans saw as the normal boundaries of mainstream politics. Even though people on the left and the right have always had a tendency to reduce the other side to its worst traits, both Clinton and Bush were still broadly understood as legitimate presidents working within the same political system. That started to change in a much more visible way with Barack Obama. Obama was not a far-left president. If anything, he governed as a moderate to center-left leader. But many on the right reacted to him as if he were a radical. Part of that was clearly about policy, but part of it was also about race. Obama's election represented a cultural shift as much as a political one, and for some Americans, the election of a black president symbolized a country changing in ways that made them uncomfortable. That discomfort helped push parts of the right further than they otherwise may have gone, not just toward traditional conservatism, but in some cases toward a more explicit nationalism and white identity politics. Donald Trump did not create those tensions out of nowhere, but he absolutely brought them to the surface and gave them a louder voice. When Trump came down the escalator and launched his campaign, it felt like the culture wars entered a completely new phase. Politics stopped being just about government policy and became deeply tied to identity, entertainment, and everyday life. Now it feels like every opinion, every personal choice, and every public stance has to fit somewhere on the political spectrum. Politics is no longer just part of public life. It has become part of pop culture. That is especially obvious in debates about race, immigration, and national identity. Trump's language did not invent radical division in the United States, but it did magnify it. Political rhetoric matters because it can validate fear, normalize resentment, and reinforce social boundaries between groups. When that happens, minorities often end up pushed even further down the symbolic and social hierarchy. At the same time, our political culture increasingly works toward reaction. People are not just developing beliefs on their own, they are also being influenced by what they see on the other side. Someone on the right hears figures like Dean or Parker and may become more conservative or nationalistic in response. Someone on the left hears voices like Andrew Wilson or Nick Fuentes and may become even more progressive in response. In other words, extremism feeds extremism. For me, instead of pushing me further to one side, it pushed me more towards the center. Watching the constant moral policing, public shaming, and ritual apologies made me feel like things had gone too far. A moment like Dean apologizing to his audience for crying after Charlie Kirk was shot says a lot about where we are now. At first, it looked like he was taking an independent human stance. Then he backed down and folded under pressure. That kind of moment captures how ideological audiences can push even the smallest deviation from the script. And that, to me, is the bigger issue in modern politics. When the center-left or center-right is in power, things tend to feel more stable and more unifying because there is at least some room for compromise and middle ground. But when the extremists gain influence, they are rarely satisfied. They keep pushing for more, demanding more ideological purity, and that makes politics more divisive. The problem is not disagreement itself. Disagreement is normal. The problem is when the loudest and most extreme voices begin to define the culture for everyone else.